Hi and welcome to episode 10 of the 21st Century Pharmacist Show. I'm excited today because we're on the second of 4 parts in the truth about fat, based on the new recommendations that we've seen about what types of fat that we should be eating. So if you missed part 1 of the truth about fat, go back and watch it, and then part 2 will make much more sense because I'm trying to build a case for what kind of decisions we make so that we can be the CEO of our own health, not based on what some organization tells me or that, but based on science and what really matters so that we can revive, thrive, and optimize. So as always, please share, please like, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and please give us good ratings, and please give us questions. Any questions you have, we'll try to get to them in future episodes. Understand we have loads of questions already that we're trying to get to, but we'll be glad to answer them. We'd love for you to come to one of our wellness workshops and we'll answer them. So we want to try to get all your questions answered so that you can make the best decisions that you can make about your health. So yesterday I talked about the differences and tried to break down the differences between omega-3s, omega-3 fatty acids, omega-6 fatty acids, and medium-chain triglycerides. So today I want to take it a step further, and we're going to look at genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, versus non-genetically modified organisms, or non-GMOs, and how this all ties into the recent recommendations that the American Heart Association made about what we should avoid and what we should replace it with. So I hope that this really helps. So go back and watch episode 1 and you'll really understand what they recommended and where we started. So today I'm writing in red and green just like yesterday. Green means that we are going to say that it's okay. Red means that we're probably trying to get you to stop from eating that or consuming that, okay? So today we're going to look at GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that is, versus non-GMOs. And of course, we're talking about foods here. We're talking about things that we would consume, okay? So let's first talk about what is a GMO and why do they do it? Well, GMO stands for genetically modified organism. And what they do is they actually change the genetics of a plant. They change its genes. They change the DNA structure of a plant so that typically it will be easier to produce in bigger quantities and so that it is resistant to most herbicides. So what they do is they want to make it easier and easier to produce more and more. And unfortunately, I don't think that we look at the expense of our health when we think about these genetically modified organisms. When you think about the fact that I won't say over, but about 70% of all processed foods, which I mentioned some yesterday, that are in our grocery stores today contain these genetically modified organisms. And we're going to talk about why that's a problem as we go through here. But just think about that. 70% of the processed foods in the grocery stores today contain these genetically modified organisms. And I think these can be very dangerous to our health. Researchers say that just 33% of our diet made up of genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, can increase our risk of premature death and many of the diseases that we suffer from today. So 33% in my diet can create issues, but yet 70% of all processed foods in the grocery stores contain these GMOs. So we have to be really selective and careful and educated about the decisions that we make on what we eat and what we buy at the grocery store. So let's just get started with that. So really the reason they make these GMOs is convenience, right? They want to make it more convenient to produce more food. And they do that at a cost to our health, even though they can typically grow these crops cheaper that way. So let's talk about it. So what are some of the most commonly grown crops that are genetically modified? Well, canola is about 90% genetically modified. And that leads to canola oil, which is a monosaturated oil. Monosaturated fat oil. Also, canola oil. Now, olives are not necessarily in the GMOs, but here's my point when I put olive oil here. Olive oil, and I'm going to put it in red for now, and I'm going to explain to you why, is also monosaturated. Again, don't look at my spelling or my writing. Is a monosaturated oil. But most conventional olive oils, or many conventional olive oils, contain 25% canola oil. So that's why I have them in red for now. If I can find a true olive oil, and olive is actually a fruit that is fresh pressed, organic, extra virgin, with no added other oils in it, specifically canola oil at this point, then we can certainly move olive oil over here. But because it's monosaturated and not saturated like we talked about yesterday, we don't want to heat with it. So we don't want to heat it. Don't heat. So it's not what we don't use for cooking. Not for cooking. Now, a lot of times we go to places and they say they're cooking with really healthy olive oil. Well, first of all, we don't know if it has canola oil in it, and we don't really want to heat our olive oil. We want to use our saturated fats that we talked about yesterday, our coconut oils, and our grass-fed butters for that. Okay? So we're going to look at that. 90% of canola oil today, or canola plant, is genetically modified, or GMOs. So then the canola oils that I get are obviously genetically modified in most cases. Corn. I believe that it's, 88% of corn is genetically modified. Now, what comes from that? Corn oil. High fructose corn syrup. Okay? And that's a cheap version of being able to make a liquid sugar, correct? But then when I go to sugar beets, it's well over 50%. I don't have an exact percentage, but well over 50% of sugar beets are genetically modified. And what comes from that? Sugar. And how does all this fit in? Well, this is the stuff that goes into those processed foods that we talked about that are in the grocery stores. And then last but not least are soy crops. 94% of soy is GMO. And what comes from that? Soybean oil. And then we have cotton. And it's greater than 90% is genetically modified. And that's where we get our cotton seed oil. So, when we look at this list, canola, olive that contains canola oil, corn oil, high fructose corn syrup, sugar, soy, soybean oil, and we start to look at the recommendations that were made, we go, well, they were higher in omega-6s and lower in omega-3s, and now we find out that the vast majority of them are genetically modified. So, what can happen when we continually eat genetically modified things? Well, let's first look at non-GMOs that we talked about yesterday, like organic, unrefined, coconut oil, which is what they're telling us not to eat, or not to eat, or eat very limited amounts, which is saturated, because they say, remember, we want to reduce saturated fats so that we can reduce LDL, and that's a whole other story that we'll get to later. Or organic, or excuse me, grass-fed, and of course hormone and antibiotic-free butter, which also contains a lot of saturated fat. And so these are stable. to cook with, to heat. Stable to cook. All right? So that's kind of our list here that we're going to go with today. Now, obviously, when we buy and recommend what we recommend in the OptiLife RX program, is that we're always buying organic, non-genetically modified in everything. But for the purpose of this, we're talking about the fats and we're talking about the recommendations that were made. And we want to give you choices and give you information to make a good choice. So that's where we're going to leave it today, but always know we're always trying to put only the best ingredients, not only in our bodies, but on our bodies. So we're always choosing organic, non-GMO when we can. The unfortunate part is there's not a lot of labeling requirements for these genetically modified things, so they can do it and they don't even have to tell us. So we have to be very careful about that. All right? So let's remember canola, olive that contains canola, corn, sugar and sugar beets, soy and cottonseed oils can be a problem. So let's look at what these can end up coming into. So this can be these genetically modified oils we talked about in plants can become amino acids, or a lot of our typical proteins on the market, and those can be plant or animal proteins. That's why we only have non-genetically modified grass-fed whey protein. They can become any processed food like cookies, cakes, crackers. Talked yesterday about like frozen pizza. Talked about microwave popcorn. I'm sure I talked about other stuff. I don't remember all of it, but of course, high fructose corn syrup, which is seemingly in almost it seems, all processed foods. So we get these genetically modified ingredients and they funnel down into all these things. But what we miss, and what is often missed, I think people know about a lot of these things have genetically modified ingredients, but what about conventional meats? What about processed meats? Or we'll call it deli meats. Some people may call it that. So how do these fit into the genetically modifieds? So what happens is, in these conventional meat lots and conventional chickens and processed meats, what do you think these animals are eating? They're eating corn and soy in a lot of cases, and just really even way worse than that. But they're fed on these feedlots, this corn and soy, these genetically modified organisms. And so then that translates into the meat that they process and we eat. So it's found in a lot of places. So what we're always recommending, again, grass-fed, grass-finished, meats and eggs and all, well, maybe not eggs, but natural pastured eggs where the chicken eats what they want. They won't just eat grass. If they do feed the chicken anything over here, what we recommend is a non-GMO feed, and they typically only do that in the winter if they have to. So what we have here are conventional meats and processed meats and the things that we would typically see. What we have here is things that are fed to things that they were designed to eat by nature, by God, okay? So when we get there, we want to look at how do we get things like, one of the big things that I should put here are natural flavors. Because these companies will just put natural flavors on things, and it can be all kinds of things like MSG, which we've talked about, monosodium glutamate, and others, which has big issues. It can be genetically modified things. It can be all this kind of stuff that we don't even have a clue what we're eating. So we need to know if there's natural flavors on anything that I'm typically recommending, I know what those natural flavors are made of, and I can certainly pass that on to you if you ask. So let's look at what happens when we find what are some of the issues, I should say, when we find health issues with people who are eating genetically modified foods? Well, we can look at things like the fact that pregnant women, they did some research and they checked the pregnant women and their unborn babies, and they could find traces of glyphosate in those women and their unborn babies. Now, why is that important? Well, this is one of the herbicides that these genetically modified plants are resistant to. So in other words, that means that this seed that's been genetically modified, when this plant grows, instead of spraying these herbicides around the plants, they spray it directly on the plants and it won't kill the plant. So it's easier for them to do this because they can just spray the whole field rather than spraying in between the crops. So the corn will be sprayed directly with this herbicide. The soy will be sprayed directly, whatever it is, the canola. And so what happens is, this then, is inside the plant. So there is no washing it off. There is no getting rid of it. It is part of this plant. And so when they tested these pregnant women and their unborn babies, they were finding levels of these herbicides in their system. Now, you might say, is that a problem? Well, genetically modified organisms, we know, can damage our DNA and our body's ability to work properly. And then we add to the fact that they have these herbicides and pesticides that they're resistant to, that now we're getting, and we're getting it in our cells. And what can that do? Well, we have things like allergies, cancers. Going to use a big word here. Mitochondrial dysfunction. And so what does mitochondrial dysfunction mean? It means that my body's ability to make energy inside the cells has been damaged. And that's because these herbicides they're chelators, and they can chelate certain minerals and make it almost impossible for my body to use those minerals efficiently to produce energy. So this is a very big deal. As a matter of fact, in my new book, The 21st Century Pharmacist, I have a whole section, we'll call it, about how this works and what it can create in our bodies and how it chelates these minerals. What else do we have? So we have allergies, cancers, mitochondrial dysfunction. It can cause nutritional deficiencies. And those are just the beginning of what we see. We can certainly have other problems with that. So when we can do and choose non-GMO fats and all foods versus GMO foods, I think that we're going to have a better outcome as much as possible. It is almost impossible to avoid all genetically modified organisms, because I think that as much as over 70% of all our crops today are actually genetically modified. That's why in our classes we teach people, we introduce them to the farmers, and we ask them to try to buy as much as they can directly from the farmer, because we know what these big companies are doing. So again, it just doesn't, to wrap up, it just doesn't make sense to me, the recommendations that were made based off Class 1 yesterday, based off Class 2 today. And look, this is just the tip of the iceberg of genetically modified stuff. This doesn't even touch it. I know I went too long yesterday, so I'm making today shorter. But I want you to know that this may be an upcoming series that we do on genetically modified things and organisms and why it's such an issue today. And because it's becoming a bigger and bigger part of our food chain and our food supply, It's really important that we understand this and the ramifications and how to stop it. Remember, in America, we have all these diseases. We have, almost 7 out of 10 people are overweight in America today. Almost 4 out of 10 are obese. Diabetes, 20 million diabetics, 60 million pre-diabetics. They say today that 1 in 2 Americans are insulin resistant. 1 in 2 men will have cancer in their lifetime. 1 in 3 women will have cancer in their lifetime. And heart disease is still the #1 killer. I talked about it yesterday. A person dies about every 33 seconds. 75 million Americans have heart disease. If we don't change what we're doing and we don't look at these things and learn about them and make better decisions and use the right techniques to give our body what it needs to be optimally healthy, well, and fit, we're going to continue to get these bad results. So make sure that you share this, like it, subscribe on YouTube, and I hope you've learned something again. Go back and watch episode 1 if you missed it. Episodes 3 and 4 will be coming next week. Thanks, we'll see you next time. And so this is kind of a list of things that you would find omega-3s in. Now these are shelf stable, meaning that they last a decent amount of time on the shelf or in our pantries, and they are they're okay to heat. So these are okay to cook with. It doesn't damage the fat. That's one of the things about saturated fats, or 2 of the things about saturated fats, is they're shelf stable and they're okay to heat because we don't damage the fat nearly as easily as we do when we get to our omega-6s.